Hymn number 508. Hymn number 508. Let's sing. The wonderful Savior is Jesus, my Lord, the wonderful Savior to be. Behind my sin, the path of the rock, where rivers of pleasure I see. Behind my soul, in the path of the rock, that shadows of my thirsty land. Behind my life, in the depths of His love, and God be there with His hand, and God be there with His hand. The wonderful Savior is Jesus, my Lord. He taketh my burden away. He holds me up, and I shall not be moved. He gives me strength as my day. Behind my soul, in the path of the rock, that shadows of dry, thirsty land. Behind my life, in the depths of His love, and God be there with His hand, and God be there with His hand. With numberless blessings, His almighty crown, and filled with His fullness divine. I sing in my rapture, glory to God, for such a Redeemer as mine. Behind my soul, in the path of the rock, that shadows of dry, thirsty land. Behind my life, in the depths of His love, and God be there with His hand, and God be there with His hand. When clothed in His brightness, transported I rise to meet Him in clouds of the sky. His perfect salvation, His wonderful love, I'll share with the millions on high. Behind my soul, in the land of the rock, that shadows of dry, thirsty land. Behind my life, in the depths of His love, and God be there with His hand, and God be there with His hand. The next song for the lesson will be hymn number 742. 742. Let's sing. When upon life's billows you are tempest tossed, when you are discouraged thinking all is lost, count your many blessings and one by one, and it will surprise you what the Lord hath done. Count your blessings and one by one, count your blessings, see what God hath done. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your many blessings, see what God hath done. Are you ever burdened with the load of care? Does the cross seem heavy? You are all to bear. Count your many blessings, every doubt will fly, and you will be singing as the days go by. Count your blessings, take them one by one. Count Count your blessings, see what God has done. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your many blessings, see what God has done. So amid the conflict, whether great or small, do not be discouraged, God is over all. Count your many blessings, angels will attend, help and comfort you through your journey's end. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your blessings, see what God has done. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your many blessings, see what God has done. Mark 915 for the song after the lesson, hymn number 915. Brother Adam.
How many thought there was going to be a lesson about typing and typing? You didn't get here for those, you're too late. Okay. Nice. See some younger faces in here. Thank you. Yeah, keep drinking. Second person I talked to this week needed a drug test. So, how many prophecies do you know of concerning the Masonic kingdom? Or the Messianic kingdom? However you want to do it.
What was the question?
How many prophecies do you know of concerning the Messianic kingdom?
40.
When they all start?
Genesis 3.
No. So you're getting more into the promise of redemption, but the kingdom. Okay?
Oh, the difference between Messianic prophecies and Messianic kingdom.
Yeah, there's a difference between Messianic prophecies and Messianic kingdom. Okay? The Messianic kingdom prophecies were very vague in most of them. And one of the earliest one is Isaiah chapter 2 and Joel 2. And reason bringing this up because there are things that tie together the Bible to the point that there's no way, if you understand it in a reasonable, that you can deny that it is inspired. And the thing of it is, the earliest and one of the best prophecies is Daniel chapter 2. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through all the prophecies, but we do want to start looking at the Messianic kingdom. That's where I'm going to go. But my point of being this is one of the primary is because when you bring up the Messianic kingdom, what will most of the religious world think of?
Prophecy of the second coming of Christ coming to earth and reign 1,000 years.
Okay? And we're going to take Daniel chapter 2 and show where they're wrong in that. And what it truly is. Okay? Have you ever read Daniel chapter 2? Okay? Did you ever fall in love with it? I don't know what it was, but about the time I was 14, 15 years old, I read it, and it just was like, wow. I was taking world history in high school, I was a sophomore, and when I'm reading that, it just all started to gel together. You know, that was a slip.
You know, those boys didn't miss that.
So we're not going to go through the whole chapter, but we're going to go through the points that really matter. The first one is to understand why we can trust Daniel's interpretation to be true. And that's part of the point of what Nebuchadnezzar set forth so that he could trust whoever gave it to him. Now notice this point here. Now in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. Then the king gave the command to call the physicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I've had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. Now, when you tell somebody you've had a dream, what is the first thing they say to you? Tell me the dream, right? So then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation. Now, how easy is that? Yeah, well, and I mean, it's not so bad when, what did Joseph do with the butler and the baker? When he found them in prison. Same thing, he said, tell me the dream. But it's interesting, when he goes to Pharaoh, he tells Pharaoh what his dream is. Without him. No one's there. Now notice, the king answered and said, the Chaldeans, my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap. What's his point here?
Do or die.
Do or die. Why? Because if you can't do this, then I know everything else you've ever told me has been a lie. I know he says, however, if you tell the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation. So what is Nebuchadnezzar putting forth as the point? You have to tell me the dream first. They answered again and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will give its interpretation. Okay? Joey made an interesting comment. But where does it ask Joey's opinion? Or mine. I got one Bible back there, got a whole lot of opinions in the margins and notes and stuff, but you know what? They're not scripture. They're conclusions of study. They're different. What are they trying to do? If you give us a dream, we'll tell you what we think it means. The king answered and said, I know for certain that you would gain time because you see that my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree for you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time has changed. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I will know that you will give me its interpretation. You ever keep telling somebody and they get you more frustrated? The Chaldeans answered the king and said, and this is a true statement, there is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore, no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such things of any physician, astrologer, or Chaldean. Now, here's the reality. Can any man do what they're asking him to do? No. It is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods who dwell in his not the flesh. Now they're getting somewhere. Except there be a God be able to give us a dream. We can't do this. For this reason, the king was angry and very furious and gave a command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. Why? They said it don't matter how long you give us, we can't do this. And that decree went out. Next verse tells us how they went and found Daniel. Daniel went to the king and pled for time. And virtually overnight, had the dream. Okay? Why does God put this in here for us to understand this? Why does he put this first part in there? What Nebuchadnezzar said you have to do?
Well, it's going to show great emphasis on what Daniel says whenever he does come and prophesy. It's going to show that he is not any ordinary man, that that through his God, he has powers that no man has. Because they've already said, there's nobody in the world can do what you just told us.
That's right. Yeah, God, Daniel says it. They said it. And God says in this decree and through Daniel, I'm with Daniel. And not only is he saying, I gave Daniel the dream and the interpretation thereof, I gave Nebuchadnezzar the dream to begin with. Now here's the real question. How important is Nebuchadnezzar to this part?
Well, he's the king of the land, and he's going to be able to favor or disfavor whoever he chooses.
This has a pronoun event, beginning of events in Nebuchadnezzar's life. And it becomes important because we can go back and we can look and see things that people couldn't see at that time, even though they were being foretold. Very close to the point. And kind of skipped over Daniel and his friends. Who's Daniel's friends? Who's his three friends that went to Babylon with him?
That's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Okay, what is that? What kind of names are those?
Chaldean.
Chaldean, Babylonian. What was Daniel's Babylonian name he was given?
Belshazzar.
Belshazzar. Okay. Their Hebrew names are actually Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And other than chapter 1 and chapter 2, that's the only time we see them used. So Daniel thanked God in the next few verses for giving him the dream, or giving him interpretation. And then he goes and finds the captain that was told to kill them all and asks for an audience with Nebuchadnezzar. There's a lesson there we should learn that's separate from the prophecy. When we have some understanding come from us or come to us, we ought to give thanks. Because if we truly understand something concerning the scriptures, God has provided it. Daniel understood that if God did not give them the answer, not only would it have been death for all the astrologers and the Chaldeans and all those under the Babylonian rule, it also would have been death for him and his three friends. So, now, the dream. And that's the first thing Daniel does is tell Nebuchadnezzar his dream. Notice something he says, you, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. The image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly clay. You watched while a stone was cut without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away. Now think about that. Where did that stone come from? Cut without hands. That's the most important part of this dream.
It's Christ.
It's Christ. It's the rock. That's where we're going to be going to. It says, so that no trace of them was found, and the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This is a dream. Now we will tell the interpretation of it before the king. Now, I did a little internet search. I wish I had a way to put this up here where I have out of my study Bible. But there are hundreds of charts on this dream. I want you to pay attention to how many kingdoms Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar. Interpretation. You, O king, are a king of kings. What does that mean? Greater king than other kings. Who else do we see called not just a king of kings, the king of kings? Christ. Book of Revelation, perfect. Okay? Notice this. For the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. What's he telling Nebuchadnezzar?
God is blessed king.
God is blessed. If not for the God of heaven, you would not be this king. And that comes important and gets repeated again later on in chapter 5, I believe it is, 4. And notice, and wherever the children of men dwell, and the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heaven, he has given them into your hand, and has made you ruler over them all. You are the head of gold. How large was the Babylonian Empire?
The largest in the world at that time.
Largest in the world at that time. In fact, what it did was it covered the known civilized world before it's over. And when you are the head of gold, what's the most powerful or precious metal we have? Gold. What's he telling him? You're the purest of these kingdoms. You're the greatest of these kingdoms. But after you shall rise another kingdom inferior to yours, then a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over the earth. And the fourth kingdom, now notice this, shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything, and like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all others. Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. I'm going to stop there. How many kingdoms have we read about? Joey says 4. That's all we read about is 4. The description of the fourth kingdom starts out with legs of iron, but then feet of iron and clay. That's talking about its progression as it grows. How many great empires have we seen in our world history? Talking about great empires. When was the last great empire?
I think the definition of great.
UK,
Huh?
probably UK.
Not really. A true world ruling empire. That's where a lot of people make mistakes.
The
Huh?
sun never set on Union Jack.
That's what they said, but,
Not the Romans.
but the Romans would be the great,
I think that's what you're looking
yeah, that's why I'm looking for Rome. If you compare Rome to Britain, Britain was never the empire Rome was.
for.
That's what I'm getting into. These were places that just everywhere they went, they conquered. Okay? And they conquered people who were most of the time equally as strong as they were. The thought that we get into when we look at it, we even see in chapter, I believe it's chapter 5 or 6, that Daniel foretells during the Medo-Persian time of the Greek Empire coming and the Roman Empire coming. In fact, he even talks about the Greek Empire being divided into 4 parts, which we see in history. When Alexander the Great dies, his kingdom was split into 4 pieces. It is said that when Alexander, who was foretold would destroy Tyre and Sidon, was actually going to bypass them, going to Jerusalem. Jerusalem elders came out and showed them the prophecies, and he goes and destroys Tyre and Sidon before going on to Persia. They just surrendered. They were never conquered. They surrendered. They said, this is part of God's plan. We're going to submit to it. So when we set up these things, we see these 4 kingdoms. That becomes important because it tells us not only is God's word true, history confirms everything that's said here. Right. Don?
Well, the 4th kingdom, being Rome, takes us all the way through to the end of Revelation. You know, what happens after that? Any kingdoms that are of the world after that don't count in the reference to the scriptures and discussion here. Discussion here takes us through the very end of Christ's coming and the resurrection and Revelation. So it completes the Bible, basically. That's what this prophecy does, is completes the Bible.
It completes the Bible, and that's important because you have people today trying to take those feet of clay and iron and those 10 toes and continue Revelation and point it to Revelation and look for that 1,000-year reign instead of look what God has already done.
A lot of Bibles have the British Empire and also America at the bottom.
Yeah, a lot of the charts, and when we read about that, first thing I thought was they talk about the European American Empire. I thought I heard there was no real American empire.
But this dream was taking Nebuchadnezzar through those 4 kingdoms, and then to the one kingdom that would be the superior kingdom to the end of time.
And
I
that,
don't care how big Russia gets, or China gets, or the United States gets, they will be subservient to that kingdom.
and that's where we're going. Because notice this point here. Here's the problem. Notice it's, and in the days of these kings. What kings is he talking about?
Kings of
These are nations getting down to the kings of that last kingdom. All this is happening during the time when Nebuchadnezzar is leading up to the final days of that final kingdom. What destroyed Rome?
Rome. Family instability.
Family instabilities?
I think it was God.
Well, it was God. It was the
Raising
problem.
them up, take from that.
Well, what did they started? When Rome started out, what did they do? What did Caesar do? Julius Caesar. When he started out with the empire, what did he do?
He wanted all the power.
He wanted all the power, but when they conquered somebody, what did they do?
They set up a public government.
A public government, but they crushed him to the point they had no choice but to follow that. What happened in their later days? When you start talking about going in and taking over the Germanic tribes and the British tribes and going up into those areas as they grew, they started making alliances with those people, not setting up puppet governments, not crushing them like they did before, but trying to intermingle with them. They started taking iron and mixing it with clay. And as they became weaker, the church became strong. God brought it to its knees. Brought them all to their knees.
So you don't think the iron and the clay is the Eastern and the Western Roman Empire?
No. No. It was already collapsing by then. They just didn't see it. In fact, most of the Eastern Western Empire was set up after Constantine tried to do a thing with the church, the Catholic Church. So you end up with the Eastern Orthodox and Holy Roman Church. By 385, Rome was doomed. They just didn't know it yet. And that's about the time they set it up. The things that come about is God trying to. Roman Empire truly stood till about 475 AD. And its basic center then, but already it was deteriorating from within. You look at some of those kings and you look at Revelation and you look at the things concerning Nero and I say Constantine, but it's not Constantine. Domitian at the end of the first century. These things were already being set forth for it to come to an end. And as Christianity grew, the empire became weaker. We're talking about true Christianity. We're not talking about the apostasy.
Well, Christianity spread outside of the Roman Empire. It covered more territory than the Roman Empire did. Once it started being preached and carried to the uttermost parts of the world,
And
and
that
beyond where the Roman Empire ever was. The Roman Empire wasn't down in Africa. It wasn't in.
yeah, it wasn't inside. It was around that northern end of Africa. It's interesting. Spain was not part of the Roman Empire, even though Britain ended up being. And Paul said he was going to Spain. Guys believe not only did he go to Spain, but he went to the British Isles as well. You got the Germanic tribes, which were born on, but the fact that the Baltic Empire was set forth at that time was going on. That's the Russian. The church, there were Christians in Russia. We find little bits and pieces of things. It is believed that Matthew, that's according to legend, went to China. And that's where he was martyred, was in China. When Paul says that Christ went out through all the earth, I think he meant it. Pretty much as far as any civilized nation that was going on. Established that time, even as Ron pointed out, around southern Africa. Where was the eunuch from that we find in Acts chapter 8? Ethiopia.
Oh, excuse me.
Ethiopia was not part of the Roman Empire. It was never part of the Roman Empire. So now, as Daniel continues, inasmuch as you saw the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king that will come to pass after this. The dream is certain and its interpretation is sure. Now, I did find one little chart I like. So I borrowed it with permission. Send them an email, they haven't responded yet, so I'm assuming I have permission. There was a footnote that if you use it, you could not claim ownership. So I'm not claiming ownership. When we think about this point here, I want you to ask a question. When Jesus spoke of the law and the prophets and himself, you know what he said? Don't think I came to destroy the law and the prophets, but to fulfill it. What does that mean?
Complete.
With him, he's going to bring it to a conclusion. It's going to be completed. Now, sometimes we want to say, well, that was immediately done at the cross. The parts concerning him and his resurrection, that was done. Well, what about some of the prophecies? Some of them were completed at the cross. When Peter starts speaking and the other 12 and at Pentecost, he said, these things are you, is what God said through Joel. He has brought forth the completion of it, but some of it is, we see the fulfillment actually in the apostles and others. This right here is not going to come fulfilled with his death and resurrection, but as the church grows. Now, once that is fulfilled, and as he would point out himself, the days of desolation of Daniel chapter 9, which would point to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, all things are fulfilled. And once the book of Revelation is complete, everything's fulfilled. How much of Revelation has been fulfilled?
Most of it.
We don't know because God hasn't told us.
I'm pretty sure. Take time to read and understand all but the last 2.5 chapters. That judgment scene you see, that's all that's left to be done in the fulfillment of everyone being lifted up into heaven. People still looking for that battle of good and evil. Don't even know they're in the middle of it.
I was just fixing to say it's happening now.
It's been happening for 2,000 years. We've been living it. Rome's fell. That part's done. You get up to the beginning of chapter 20, that's where it stops with, is the destruction of Rome. Chapter 19 ends. 20 starts looking at the reign. He's been reigning. So in that point, there's no premillennialism. There's not going to be 1,000 years, but we're going. Here's an interesting part. Everyone that teaches premillennialism, what they say is going to happen. They're going to say he's going to reign again. Who's he going to reign over? Here's an interesting point. Every one of them talk about an apocalypse where all the saved are called up into heaven. Who's left? The unsaved. What do you think? And every one of them that teach that talk about the chaos that's going to go on the earth. Now, how's Christ going to reign over those people? See, this is what doesn't make sense. Things have to make sense. God never said a 5th kingdom, he said 4 kingdoms. And he explained that 4th kingdom would start out very strong, but then would intermingle and become weaker. And it would be at that time that his kingdom would destroy it. Here's what we have. I don't necessarily agree with that line, prophecy of the first coming of Christ. It does to a point point to that because with him comes his church. Babylon existed from about 605 to 539 BC. Persia and the Medes were actually a sub-kingdom of the Persians. They had initially captured Babylon, but they only did it with Persia's help, and Persia took over them immediately. When you read of King Cyrus, that's the Persian king, called King of Kings. But when you read of King Darius the Mede in Daniel, that is the king over the Babylonian province. They didn't call them, they had governors and satraps, as they called them, underneath those kings. But as far as the initial of each territory, it had its own king that answered to what we would more commonly refer to as an emperor. But they called him the King of Kings. And incidentally, that goes back from being passed down from God, calling Nebuchadnezzar a King of Kings. Bronze speaks of Alexander the Great, right up into the point of the four generals that took over the various kingdoms of the empire from 333 BC to 31 AD. And then you have Rome. Now it's interesting, this one gives a date of 325 AD. What happened in 325 AD? Iron clay.
The Roman Catholic.
Council of Nicaea.
Council of Nicaea. Okay. Constantine became emperor. Constantine had a revelation. He says, we cannot keep the kingdom together and continue fighting against Christianity. So he said he had a vision from his dead mother who told him to become a Christian. And he made Christianity the national religion. Gave birth to the Roman Catholic Church, so to speak. And not shortly after that, he pushed it into the Eastern Orthodox and the Holy Roman Empire. But here comes the point. What did Jesus say to Peter in Matthew chapter 16?
On this rock will I build my church.
Romans,
Excuse me.
Go ahead.
And the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it.
That's predominantly needed right there instead of saying hell, Hades. Okay? Death, the grave. What happens when a Christian dies?
Go to paradise.
Go to paradise. Where's paradise? Hades. Okay, what can happen to a Christian as long as he's alive?
They can lose their salvation.
They can lose their salvation. But once they're dead,
Your faith is sealed.
their faith is sealed. They're cemented into the church. See, that's what Jesus is talking about. Death will not destroy the church. Because when Christians die, they're still part of the church. So death can't prevail against the church. But the rock, what was the rock? What was Peter's confession?
Thou art Christ.
Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said, upon this rock, the truth that I am the Son of God, I will build my church. My church. When John the Baptist started preaching, what did he preach? The kingdom of his heaven is at hand. When Jesus started preaching, what did he preach? The kingdom of heaven is at hand. What does that hand mean?
Right
Right there.
right there.
It's reaching. It's at hand. It's at hand's reach. It's so close on the scene that you ought to be able to see it if you're paying attention. It's here. You're about to see it. Now, what does that do with wanting that extended up to our time? See, here's the question. If the church is this fifth kingdom, the kingdom hewn out of stone, then we have to see it being established in the first century.
That's the other fallacy with premillennialism, is that they don't recognize the earthly church as God's kingdom at this point. That church, that kingdom, they say, has to be established at some point in the future.
Because why? Where do they want Jesus to rule from?
Earth.
Earth.
Kingdom in Jerusalem, on the throne in Jerusalem.
On the throne in Jerusalem. Even the Roman Catholic Church teaches that the church was an afterthought after the Jews rejected Jesus as king.
So they deny God's power.
They deny everything that Ron's teaching in his Bible class on Sunday morning.
God's power.
God's power. God's power to work through time and work things through to bring about what he wants. When Paul writes Galatians chapter 4, he says, at the fullness of time, God brought forth his son, born of a woman. What does that fullness of time mean?
King James read when the time was right.
It's
This time, when the time, that's what it really means there, is when the time was ready, when all things were set forth, when God had brought everything to where it needed to be for this to happen. God's trying to tell us sometimes we don't get it. God's a lot wiser than me. I don't know why we have the president we do, but God does. But he still brings in kings and brings down kings. He brought these four empires not just into existence because he favored them, but to lead up to that last point. He used these four empires to prepare the world for the coming of his son. So what we're going to start next week is looking at the establishment of the Messianic kingdom. Going through the book of Acts. Okay. Joey, what's your number?
915.
915. See, you can take all my time, man. I got the midnight. Let's stand and sing it.
When we walk with the Lord in the light of his word, what a glory he shares on our way. While we do his good will, he abides with us still, and with all who will trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way. trust and obey. Then in fellowship sweet, we will sit at his feet, or will walk by his side in the way. What he says we will do, where he says we will go. Never fear, only trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey.
After the prayer, stick around for 1 second. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the time that we were able to spend here this evening to sing songs of praise to you and to listen to a piece of your word and the meanings behind it. And Lord, we know, even though we were looking in the Old Testament,